Guys are looking pretty sharp for a bunch of casual Californians. Thank you all very much for coming. It's always a remarkable thing to see. See so many people out for what? A serious conversation. It's like, don't you have anything better to do than that? So, hopefully not. Hopefully not. I think I'll start by just talking to you about some of the things that are going on around me. I was just in Miami for about 10 days. So some of you may know that back in 2017, I did a series of lectures. It was the first time that I had booked public theater. I did a series of lectures on Genesis, which I had wanted to do for a long time, and it struck me at that time, it was just before my first popular book came out, that maybe there was, oddly enough, a public appetite for such a thing. And so my family and I took a risk and booked a theater for, I think, 16 evenings, something like that. And that worked out real well, you know. We packed the theater, strangely enough, mostly with young men. Group notoriously difficult to attend to anything that might be associated, particularly with religious matters, you know. So it was really strange that happened, to say the least. And the first lecture was 2 hours on the first sentence of Genesis, which is, I thought I'd never get through the whole story. It's like 2 hours per sentence, man. I'm going to be like older than Methuselah by the time I'm finished. So. And it went very well, and I learned an awful lot doing it, and it became very popular on YouTube as well. I think the first lecture has 10 million views, something like that, and it's been remarkable really to watch that, because it's generated a positive response among a very, I hate this word, diverse range of people. A lot of Orthodox Christians, Orthodox Jews, a lot of Muslims, a lot of Catholics, religious people. That's somewhat unsurprising. But also a lot of atheists, and that was more surprising. And it also generated a fair bit of conversation among people who are involved in the formal church, regardless of denomination, because they were mystified by the fact that, you know, the church attendance tends to be shrinking, not in all denominations, but certainly generally in the West. There's some evangelical churches that have sort of bucked that trend because they've capitalized on the social element of church attendance. But by and large, it's a downhill trajectory, and it's a bit of a mystery why whatever it was that I was doing attracted positive attention, especially from the most difficult audience to attract to such things. And there's been other people emerge since, like Jonathan Pageau. I don't know how many of you know about Pageau, but he has a channel called This Symbolic World on YouTube. And Pageau's an Orthodox Christian, an icon carver, and his work has proved quite influential. The Orthodox Church, Christian church in North America, is actually growing in attendance quite rapidly, and large part of that's a consequence of Pageau's work. And he works in the same domain as I do, which is something like the demystification of the symbolic realm, and which is a rather awkward way of talking about how to talk about deep stories so that the meaning of those stories is revealed to people. And, you know, we all have a sense, regardless of where we stand on the religious issue, we all have a sense that some stories are shallow and trivial and some stories are deep and profound. And I would say technically that the realm of what is deepest and most profound is by definition the religious realm. And again, this is independent of the particulars of your belief. And so I've been interested in continuing the Genesis adventure. I had a dream, I suppose, about 15 years ago, I started thinking about this, that I would walk through the entire biblical corpus. And that got interfered with for a variety of reasons. I was going to go to Cambridge and do a seminar on Exodus. I was invited to Cambridge to do that. And then that got canceled, and then COVID hit, and that was a mess. And I got invited back to Cambridge eventually after a 3-year battle behind the scenes there at that university, where they changed the whole speech code. And I think now we'll change the free speech provisions in the UK as a whole as a consequence. So that was a good deal. But the upshot of all that was that I organized a seminar on Exodus in Miami with the Daily Wire Plus people, and I've been very privileged because I go all over the world and I meet people in all sorts of different countries. I have people scouting out who to meet in all these countries, and so it's quite remarkable to be able to do that and to meet with cultural and political leaders, thought leaders in all these different countries. But one of the huge advantages of that is I can find stellar people, and I found a variety of people and invited them to come to Miami to undertake a seminar on Exodus. And Exodus is a fascinating story, a very, very deep story, immensely complex. Now, the biblical stories are complex and deep for a variety of reasons. I mean, they're part of an ancient oral tradition, and stories that are transmitted orally tend to modify themselves across time as they're transmitted, so that everything that's forgettable and dull disappears. And you can imagine why that would be, because if you're transmitting a story across, it can be tens of thousands of years, anything that isn't memorable is going to be forgotten. And so all that gets left in the story is that part of the story no one can forget. And so you can imagine a story that's been iterated over multiple generations for thousands of years it gets purified, and creative people work on it too, and maybe they elaborate the story in one way or another, adding a detail here and there that just seems to fit right? It just makes the story that much more interesting. So it's as if the story modifies itself across time to become maximally interesting and maximally memorable. And that's the stories that we're left with if we're part of an unbroken tradition. And so that's pretty interesting. And it's very interesting to try to crack those stories and to understand what it is that makes them memorable and significant. And so I gathered together 8 or 9 people, depending on the day, who I thought had something something unique to contribute to exegesis, right, to the explanation of biblical stories. And some of them, Dennis Prager was there, for example. Some of you know about Prager. He runs PragerU and has run a radio show for years. And he's like your favorite uncle. And a very, very good sense of humor, but a deep biblical scholar. And we had Shapiro there this time, Ben Shapiro, who's, got a machine gun intelligence and an unbelievably deep knowledge of the Jewish scriptures. Really quite remarkable to watch. Pajot was there. My friend Greg Hurwitz, who's a denizen of LA, participated. Variety of biblical scholars from Cambridge. And we released the first 8 episodes. Originally, I thought we could cover all of Exodus in 8 sessions, but that turned out to be wrong. And the Daily Wire Plus folks, that's Shapiro's organization, agreed to double the length of the recording. And so we broke it into 2 sections. And I was in Miami this last week recording the last 8 sessions. We walked through the remainder of Exodus and then into some of the books that follow Exodus, where the story of the Israelites wandering through the desert is elaborated right to its conclusion. And so that was extremely, extremely interesting. I learned so much from it. Now, I wanted to do that because I want to do a public lecture series by myself on Exodus, and I'm setting up a theater to do that. I'm going to do that later this year. I found this cool theater. It's got about 1,000 seats for a live audience, but it has screens around it, big, like 40 by 20 foot screens, and a big screen on the stage, and it can broadcast to about 1 million people using elaborated Zoom technology, and then you can see all the people. It'll flash different thousands of people, and so you can see them all, and so you can really have a stadium with 1 million people in it. And so going to do that later this year, God willing, let's say. So that's extremely exciting. I'll tell you a couple of things I learned. Now, I should also point out more practically. So right now the content is paywalled behind the Daily Wire Plus, boundary. And it was a relatively costly venture to undertake. We had to bring these people from all over the world and find them a place to live and, make all the studio arrangements and all that. And the production quality is quite high. And so, but I've negotiated with the Daily Wire, and they've generously offered to make all of these 17, there's 17 episodes publicly available. So they're going to be launched on YouTube very soon, one at a time, over a 17-week period, and then we'll keep them on YouTube and on the Daily Wire Plus platform for everyone to watch for no charge for some period of time, several months, 4 months, I think might be the plan. So that's coming up real soon, and so I'm really excited about that, and I'll tell you a little bit about the structure of the Exodus story to kick this off tonight. So these are all things that are like a deep story. A deep story is deep because it pertains to many things simultaneously. Now, the biblical stories tend to be deep partly because every story is related to every other story in the whole text. So imagine the Bible was put together across, thousands of years, and the people who were aggregating the stories knew all the other stories. And so all the stories are interrelated. There's a great map that you can find online, which is a map of the relationship of all the biblical verses, chapters to one another. And any given chapter might refer to 50 other chapters. And so you can imagine those are like pathways through the book. This chapter pertains to this chapter, and 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 so forth. And so that gives it a kind of depth because it's the world's first hyperlinked text. Really, that's literally the case. And so, because it's self-referential. And the beginning refers to the end, and the end refers to the beginning. And so that gives it a depth. But there's another depth, an angle of depth too. A great story is true psychologically and sociologically at the same time. It has a pattern that can be read as if it's a personal journey, or if it can be read as a journey that many people can take simultaneously in the social environment. I can give you an example of that. So in the story of Sleeping Beauty, the Disney story, there's the idea that the sleeping princess is woken up by the prince, right? And so you could read that as like a patriarchal narrative, is that an adolescent girl is basically unconscious until the hero comes along and with a kiss wakes her up. And there's some truth in that, right? Because everybody wakes up in a relationship. I mean, everyone's asleep before they have an intimate relationship, and maybe even then, and maybe asleep too till they have children, because that also tends to wake you up literally in the middle of the night, and then also metaphysically. But you can read that story. So you can read that story that a woman needs a man to emerge out of unconsciousness. There's lots of stories where the reverse is true, by the way. That's what happens in Beauty and the Beast, right? Because the Beast is an unconscious man, essentially, and he's transformed into something approximating a reasonable catch by Beauty, who's very attractive and also, very intelligent and discriminating. So these things don't just go one way. But you can also read the story psychologically. So you might say that in order for an adolescent girl to become fully adult and awake, she has to, the part of her that's heroic and capable of taking on the great dragon of being, because that's what happens with the prince, remember? That part has to wake up and become part of her. And so you can read it as a psychological drama too. And it's not like one of those readings is correct and the other isn't. It's that the story is so deep and old. And fairy tales, we know there are fairy tales that are 15, 20,000 years old. They're so profound that they can do multiple things at the same time. And so Exodus is certainly a story that falls into that category. And so I'll just walk you through it socially and psychologically. So Exodus puts forward a number of propositions that are implicit in the narrative. So here's one. Exodus presents a characterization of the guiding spirit of mankind. Okay, now you could say that's God, but we'll just leave that aside for a moment. Say, well, are there spirits that guide mankind? And the answer is yes. And if nothing else, you're guided by the spirit of your stomach, right? Or you're guided by the spirit of your anger, or you're guided by the spirit of your sexual desire. And one of the things you might want to understand, if you are impulsively guided by those spirits, is that that's not really you, right? Like sexual desire isn't really you. And why would I say that? Well, it's because not only does everyone else have sexual desire, so do animals. It's not you. It's something that has you. And when it has you, it tells you how to act and how to perceive and what to want. And you might think that you're free in your hedonism, let's say, but you're not. You're just under the sway of a relatively primordial spirit. And the same goes for anger, and the same goes for hunger. And whatever you are, if you're a relatively well-integrated person, isn't just the sequencing of those more primordial spirits. That's how a 2-year-old acts, right? They're hungry, and then they're tired, and then they're too hot, and then they're too cold, and then they're too angry, and then they're too happy, and they just cycle through these they cycle through a succession of possession by primordial spirits. Which is one of the reasons they're so fun to be around, because they're fully alive, but it's pretty chaotic. And one of the things that you do as a parent is you help the child learn to integrate all those competing spirits into what eventually becomes the child's more mature personality. And you would associate that with something like the development of self-control, right? And maturation, the ability to play with other children, for example, and not to be impulsively selfish at every second so that they're completely unpopular because they only want what they want, and that's that. And so part of what happens as your personality matures, it's like a movement towards a monotheism. That's a reasonable way of thinking about it, where you take all these pagan spirits that would otherwise possess you and meld them into something approximating a unity. And as that happens in societies, technically what you have is a movement from polytheism to monotheism. And that's completely independent of whether or not there are any gods or whether there's one God. Whether or not there are gods or God depends to a large degree on how you conceptualize that. And that brings us back to Exodus. So what happens in Exodus, this is so much worth thinking about when you're thinking about what you believe. So there's a proposition put forward in Exodus, and the proposition is the central unifying spirit of mankind, so that's this monotheistic deity, is the spirit that punishes the tyrant and that calls those who are enslaved to freedom. And then you could read that psychologically and socially. So it's certainly possible that you can tyrannize yourself with your own authoritarian impulses. That's what you do when you double down, like the Pharaoh does when Moses calls him to free the people. He doubles down and becomes even more tyrannical. And people do that to themselves all the time. You get stubborn, you get backed into a corner, you bloody well know perfectly well you're wrong, but instead of just humbling yourself and admitting that you're a fool, you stick even tighter to your foolishness and you let all hell break around you. And part of what Exodus does is examine how that happens. Well, it happens to you individually, but it can also happen socially, because a whole society can become tyrannical in exactly that manner. And we have a sense in our culture that's quite deep that tyranny is wrong. And one of the things you have to ask yourself is, well, why do you believe that? Like, why do you not assume that, especially